The sound of a pen scratching paper is not supposed to be the loudest thing in a room full of machines designed to keep you alive. But that night, in the cardiac ICU of Pittsburgh General Hospital, I heard my sister's signature like a scream. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm, and Lauren pressed her pen to the form that would end my life. I tried to speak, but the oxygen mask swallowed my words. I tried to move, but my body had betrayed me hours ago. All I could do was watch as my sister signed the refusal of treatment form without a single moment of hesitation. Her handwriting was perfect, confident, the penmanship of a woman who had never doubted herself in her entire life. She looked at the doctor and said the words I will carry with me until the day I actually die. Don't waste money on her. She's been a burden her whole life. Let nature take its course. My father stood by the window. He did not turn around. My mother stared at the floor, clutching her purse like it contained something precious. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. The heart monitor began to stutter, my rhythm faltering, and still they stood there like statues in a museum of family betrayal. I reached toward them. My arm trembled with the effort, the IV tube pulling at my skin. Mom, I thought. Dad. Please, I'm your daughter too. But they wouldn't look at me. They had already made their choice. The monitor's beeping grew erratic. My vision started to blur at the edges. And that's when I saw him. A figure in the doorway. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a white coat. He stood perfectly still, watching everything unfold. No one else seemed to notice him. No one else turned around. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know that my grandfather had spent the last year of his life preparing for exactly this moment. And I didn't know that 3 weeks later, at the reading of Grandpa Robert's will, that man would open a medical file, speak one sentence, and end everything my sister had built. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why my sister wanted me dead, you need to understand what it meant to be the sick daughter in a family that only valued strength. My name is Megan Sullivan. I'm 33 years old, and I was born with a heart that never worked quite right. Congenital heart defect, the doctors called it. A valve that didn't close properly, a rhythm that skipped and stuttered, a chest that always felt too tight. I've had 3 major surgeries and more hospital stays than I can count. I've spent my entire life being careful, being quiet, being small enough that my broken heart wouldn't inconvenience anyone. I work as an accountant at a mid-size firm in Philadelphia. I have my own apartment, my own savings, my own life that I built piece by piece while my family looked the other way. None of them know about my promotion last year. None of them know I paid off my student loans. None of them have ever thought to ask. In my family, there were 2 daughters. Lauren was the investment. I was the expense. Lauren was healthy, athletic, ambitious, destined for success. I was the girl who might die at any moment, the constant reminder of everything that could go wrong. My parents poured their resources into Lauren's future. They poured their resentment into my present. The only exception was my grandfather. Robert Sullivan was a contractor who built houses for 40 years with his own hands. He had rough palms and a soft heart, and he was the only person in my family who ever made me feel like my existence wasn't a mistake. I remember being 10 years old, lying in a hospital bed after my second heart surgery. My parents had left early for Lauren's soccer tournament. I was crying when Grandpa Robert walked in. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat on the edge of my bed and took my hand in his calloused fingers. "Megan," he said, "you are the heart of this family, even if they can't see it. A heart doesn't have to be loud to be strong. Remember that." I didn't fully understand what he meant, but I held on to those words for the next 23 years like a life raft in an ocean of silence. 3 weeks before I ended up in that ICU, my phone buzzed with a text message from my mother. Not a call. A text. "Dad passed this morning. Funeral Saturday. Let us know if you're coming. She had sent it 6 hours after he died, 6 hours of my grandfather being gone from this world, and no one thought to pick up the phone. I drove 4 hours from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh to say goodbye to the only person who had ever truly loved me. I didn't know that by the end of that week, I would be fighting for my own life while my sister signed papers to let me die. And I didn't know that Grandpa Robert, even from the grave, had already made sure I wouldn't face that fight alone. The funeral was held at St. Matthew's Church on a gray October morning. Light rain fell against the stained glass windows, and the smell of lilies filled the air so thickly I could taste it. Grandpa Robert had attended this church for 50 years. He had helped rebuild the entrance steps after a storm in 1987. Now his photograph sat on an easel beside the altar, his kind eyes looking out at a congregation full of people who claimed to love him. I arrived early, or so I thought. But when I walked through the heavy wooden doors, the family had already taken their positions. Lauren sat in the front pew, draped in black designer fabric, dabbing her eyes with a tissue, while relatives clustered around her, offering sympathy. My mother sat beside her, one arm around Lauren's shoulders. My father occupied the end of the pew, stoic and silent. No one had saved me a seat. I slipped into the back row, trying not to draw attention. An elderly woman I didn't recognize glanced at me, then looked away. A cousin whose name I couldn't remember nodded once without smiling. I folded my hands in my lap and stared at my grandfather's photograph, willing myself not to cry. The service began. The pastor spoke about Robert's dedication to his community, his decades of honest work, his love for his family. Then my mother stood and announced that Lauren would deliver the eulogy, because Lauren had been such a comfort to their father in his final days. I gripped the pew until my knuckles went white. Lauren walked to the podium with the measured grace of someone who had practiced this moment in front of a mirror. She spoke about Grandpa's wisdom, his gentle humor, his pride in watching her build her real estate career. She mentioned childhood memories that I suspected she had invented on the drive over. She cried at all the right moments, her voice breaking beautifully for the congregation. She spoke for 15 minutes. She never said my name, not once. When she finished, the congregation applauded softly. My mother embraced her. My father nodded his approval, and I sat in the back row wondering if anyone would notice if I simply stopped existing. After the service, everyone gathered at my grandfather's house. The home he had built with his own hands 45 years ago was now filled with casserole dishes and distant relatives and photographs of Lauren at every stage of her accomplished life. I found exactly one picture of myself, half hidden behind a potted plant. I was 6 years old in the photo, lying in a hospital bed. Even in the family gallery, I was the sick one. Lauren held court in the living room, accepting condolences like a queen receiving tribute. My mother introduced her to every guest with the same rehearsed line. Lauren handled all the arrangements. We couldn't have managed without her. Meanwhile, I stood near the kitchen holding a plate of food I couldn't eat, watching relatives glance at me with vague recognition before moving on to someone more important. Then a hand touched my elbow. I turned to find Margaret, my grandfather's elderly cousin, standing beside me with knowing eyes. "Your grandfather talked about you all the time," she said quietly. "Every time I visited, it was Megan called this. Megan sent me that." "He did?" Margaret leaned closer. "He said you were the only one who understood him. He said he had something planned for you. Something important." Before I could ask what she meant, my mother appeared at my shoulder. "Margaret, come say hello to the Hendersons." She guided the old woman away without acknowledging me. Margaret looked back once, her expression heavy with words she couldn't say. Something planned. The phrase echoed in my mind as the evening wore on. Dinner was a strange affair. After the relatives left, it was just the four of us at the table where I had eaten countless silent meals as a child. Lauren poured herself a large glass of wine and did something unexpected. She was nice to me. She asked about my job in Philadelphia. She suggested I stay a few extra days so we could spend time together as sisters. It felt wrong. Lauren being kind to me was like a cat presenting a dead bird. It looked like a gift, but something had definitely died to make it happen. I excused myself to use the bathroom. On my way back, I paused in the hallway. My mother's voice drifted from the kitchen, sharp and tired. She was on the phone with someone. "At least Lauren can handle the estate," she said. "Not like the other one. Always sick, always needing something. Some people just take and take." I pressed my hand to my chest. My heart was already beating too fast. I made it to the kitchen before my legs gave out. The collapse came without warning. One moment I was standing by the sink. The next I was on the floor, surrounded by broken glass. My chest felt like someone had wrapped iron bands around it and was pulling them tighter with every breath. I heard footsteps. Lauren's voice. What now? She stood in the doorway, arms crossed, sighing like I had spilled wine on her favorite rug. "She's being dramatic," Lauren said to my mother. "She always does this for attention." The last thing I heard before the ambulance arrived was my sister's voice, sharp with irritation, saying something I will never forget. "She always has to make everything about herself." I wanted to laugh. I was having a heart attack, and somehow I was still the inconvenience. I woke to the sound of machines, beeping monitors, humming ventilators, the soft shuffle of nurses' shoes on linoleum. The ceiling above me was white and unfamiliar. My mouth tasted like metal and medicine. For a moment, I didn't know where I was or how I had gotten there. Then, I remembered. The kitchen floor, the broken glass, Lauren's voice calling me dramatic, while my heart tried to tear itself apart. A nurse appeared beside my bed. She was in her 50s, with kind eyes and efficient hands. Her name tag read, Patricia. She checked my vitals, adjusted my IV, offered me ice chips for my dry throat. "You had a significant cardiac event," she explained gently. "Your heart went into arrhythmia. We stabilized you, but the doctors need to discuss next steps with your family." "Where is my family?" Patricia hesitated. Something flickered across her face. "They're in the waiting room. They've been discussing things." "Discussing what?" She didn't answer. Instead, she leaned closer and lowered her voice. "Ms. Sullivan, when the doctor comes, make sure you understand everything before anyone signs anything. Do you understand?" I nodded, confused but suddenly alert. Patricia squeezed my hand once, then left without another word. They came in the morning. My mother, my father, my sister, and a doctor I didn't recognize. "Dr. Morrison," his badge said. He was in his 40s, professional, carrying a clipboard like a shield. "Mrs. Sullivan," he began, addressing the room more than me. "Your sister experienced a serious cardiac arrhythmia triggered by stress and a missed medication dose. The underlying issue is a congenital valve defect that has worsened over time. We need to perform an emergency catheter ablation to correct the electrical pathway causing the problem." Lauren crossed her arms. "What does that mean in terms of cost?" "The procedure is necessary but carries some risks, about a 3 to 5% chance of complications. Cost-wise, we're looking at $40,000 to $60,000 depending on what we find." "And if we don't do it?" Dr. Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "Without intervention, she's at high risk for another episode, potentially fatal." I tried to sit up. "I can make my own decisions. I'm conscious now." Lauren ignored me completely. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folder of documents. "I'm her healthcare proxy. I have medical power of attorney." The words hit me like a physical blow. Healthcare proxy. I had never signed anything giving Lauren that authority. I had never agreed to let my sister make life or death decisions on my behalf. When did I started. Mom and Dad signed the paperwork 2 years ago, Lauren said smoothly. For emergencies. You know how you are. Dr. Morrison examined the documents. This appears to be in order. Ms. Sullivan, as healthcare proxy, you'll need to indicate whether you consent to the procedure. Lauren didn't hesitate. She took the clipboard, flipped to the second page, and signed her name in the box marked Refusal of Treatment. We're declining, she said. Lauren, no. I tried to grab the clipboard, but my arms were too weak. What are you doing? She turned to Dr. Morrison with the calm expression of someone ordering lunch. Don't waste money on her. She's been a burden her whole life. Let nature take its course. I looked at my mother. She was staring at the floor, clutching her purse, saying nothing. I looked at my father. He had turned toward the window, hands in his pockets, studying the parking lot like it held the answers to the universe. Mom? My voice cracked. Dad? Please, don't let her do this. Neither of them moved. Neither of them spoke. They had made their choice, and their choice was silence. The heart monitor began to scream. My rhythm was destabilizing, the line on the screen jumping wildly. Dr. Morrison moved toward me, but Lauren stepped back with an irritated sigh. She's being dramatic, she said. She always does this for attention. That's when I saw him. A man in the doorway. Tall, silver-haired, wearing a white coat. He stood perfectly still, watching everything with an expression I couldn't read. Then he moved. He walked directly to Dr. Morrison, took the signed refusal form from his hands, and tore it in half. Then quarters. He dropped the pieces into the trash can beside my bed. What do you think you're doing? Lauren's voice went shrill. I'm her healthcare proxy. That's a legal document. The man turned to face her. His voice was cold and steady as steel. I'm Dr. Andrew Collins, Chief of Cardiology at this hospital, and I can do exactly what I just did, because your healthcare proxy was revoked 2 months ago. Lauren's face went white. That's impossible. Robert Sullivan contacted me in August. He was concerned about exactly this scenario. Dr. Collins looked at Lauren with something close to disgust. He filed paperwork removing you as Megan's proxy and appointing me as her medical advocate in emergencies. Grandpa wouldn't... Grandpa did. Collins stepped closer to her, and Lauren actually backed away. Because he knew exactly who you are. He told me that when this moment came, and he was certain it would come, I should remember his exact words. Collins paused. The room was absolutely silent, except for the steadying beep of my heart monitor. He said, When it happens, don't let them kill my granddaughter. He turned to Dr. Morrison. Prep her for surgery. I'll scrub in myself. Then he looked at my family with cold finality. Get out, all of you. Now. Security arrived within minutes. I watched my family escorted from the room. Lauren's face was twisted with fury. My mother was crying. My father still hadn't said a single word. Dr. Collins stood beside my bed as the anesthesiologist prepared my IV. His voice was gentle now, nothing like the steel he had shown my sister. You're going to be okay, Megan. Your grandfather made sure of it. The medication began to pull me under. The last thing I saw was Collins standing guard at the door, arms crossed, making absolutely certain my family couldn't get back in. The last thing I heard was his voice, quiet but certain. Robert, I kept my promise. I woke to warmth instead of cold. The heated blanket wrapped around me felt like an embrace, so different from the sterile chill of the ICU. The beeping was softer now, less urgent, measuring a heart that had decided to keep beating after all. Afternoon sunlight filtered through window blinds, casting gentle stripes across the white sheets. I was in a private room. Someone had arranged that. Yellow roses sat on the windowsill, their petals bright against the gray October sky. Grandpa Robert's favorite flowers. I stared at them for a long moment, wondering if I was dreaming. "Welcome back, Megan." I turned my head. Dr. Collins sat in a chair by the window, still wearing surgical scrubs. He looked tired, the kind of tired that comes from hours of concentration, but his eyes were warm as he moved his chair closer to my bed. "The surgery went perfectly," he said. "Your heart is stable. You're going to be fine." My throat was raw, my voice barely a whisper. "You saved my life." "I made a promise to someone. I always keep my promises." "Where is my family?" Collins paused, choosing his words carefully. "They're in the waiting room. I've restricted visitor access to your room." "All of them?" "Your sister attempted to contact hospital administration to override my authority." A slight smile crossed his face. "She was unsuccessful. Your mother has called the nurses' station 4 times. Your father hasn't said a word to anyone." I laughed, though it hurt my chest. That sounds about right. I expected to feel sad. Instead, I felt relief. For the first time since arriving in Pittsburgh, no one from my family could reach me. No one could stand over my bed and sigh with disappointment. No one could sign papers to let me die. "Robert told me you were stronger than they gave you credit for," Collins said quietly. "He was right." "How did you know my grandfather?" Collins leaned back in his chair. "I met Robert 42 years ago. I was a first-year medical resident, 26 years old, terrified of everything. I was eating lunch alone in the hospital courtyard, seriously considering quitting medicine entirely. What happened? Robert sat down next to me. Complete stranger. He was working construction on a hospital addition at the time. He looked at me and said, 'You look like a man carrying a weight too heavy for one person.'" Collins shook his head, smiling at the memory. "We talked for 2 hours. He didn't give me advice. He just listened. And somehow, by the end of that conversation, I knew I couldn't quit." "That sounds like Grandpa." "We stayed friends for 4 decades after that. I went to his wedding anniversary parties. He came to my daughter's graduation. When his heart started failing 10 years ago, I became his personal physician." Collins's voice softened. "He was the most decent man I ever knew. He never asked for anything. He just showed up when people needed him." "So why did he ask you to help me?" Collins was quiet for a moment. "About 18 months ago, Robert started asking me hypothetical questions. What if someone with a heart condition was denied treatment? What legal protections exist? How could a doctor intervene? I thought he was just curious. Then, 6 months ago, he told me the truth." "What truth?" "He said you were in danger. Not immediately, maybe not for years. But he knew that when he died, your family would come for you." Collins met my eyes. "He said Lauren saw you as competition for his inheritance, a drain on resources that should go to her. He said your parents would never stand up to her because they never had before." The words hit me like stones. Grandpa had known. He had seen what I had spent 33 years trying not to see. "He didn't want to believe it," Collins continued. "But he prepared anyway. He hired a lawyer. He revoked Lauren's healthcare proxy. He appointed me as your emergency medical advocate. He created a trust specifically for your medical expenses." "A trust?" Collins reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder. $200,000, designated solely for your cardiac care. He saved for decades to make sure you would never have to worry about affording treatment. I couldn't speak. My grandfather, who had never been wealthy, who had worked with his hands his entire life, had saved $200,000 to keep me alive. Collins reached into his briefcase again and produced a sealed envelope. My name was written on the front in Grandpa's familiar handwriting. Below it, 5 words. Open when you need strength. Robert gave this to me 8 months ago, Collins said. He told me I would know when to give it to you. I took the envelope with trembling hands. I could feel several pages inside. I traced my name with my fingertip, recognizing the handwriting from birthday cards and Christmas notes, and all the small moments when my grandfather had reminded me I existed. I couldn't open it. Not yet. A knock interrupted us. A nurse entered, her expression tight. "Dr. Collins, Miss Sullivan's sister is demanding to see her. She says she has a right as family." Collins stood, his voice firm. "She has no rights here. I've documented her attempt to refuse life-saving treatment. Any contact with the patient requires my explicit approval. She's threatening to call her lawyer. Tell her to call whoever she wants." Collins almost smiled. "Robert Sullivan's lawyers are better." After the nurse left, I looked up at the man who had saved my life twice in one day. "Why did you do all this? You didn't have to keep that promise. Grandpa was gone. No one would have known." Collins paused at the door. "Robert Sullivan sat with me when I was a scared young man ready to give up. He didn't have to do that either. No one would have known." He turned back to face me. "Some debts can never be fully repaid, Megan, but we try anyway." After he left, I sat alone in the quiet room, holding my grandfather's unopened letter against my chest. Through the window, I could see the parking lot below. Lauren's black Mercedes was still there, parked illegally in a handicap spot. She was waiting. Planning. I knew my sister well enough to know she wouldn't accept this defeat, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid of her, because I finally understood something Grandpa Robert had tried to tell me my whole life. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. I just hadn't known who was standing with me. By Monday morning, I was strong enough to sit up without assistance. The heart monitor showed a steady rhythm, and the nurses had started talking about discharge in a few days. My body was healing. My mind was still trying to catch up. Grandpa's letter sat unopened on my bedside table. I had looked at it 100 times, traced my name with my fingers, imagined what words might be inside. But I wasn't ready yet. Some truths need time before you can face them. Dr. Collins arrived after breakfast. His expression was different today, heavier somehow. He closed the door behind him and pulled his chair close to my bed. "Megan, how are you feeling? Strong enough for a difficult conversation?" "I've had enough difficult conversations to last a lifetime." I tried to smile. "What's one more?" Collins opened his briefcase and removed a folder thick with documents. "Your grandfather kept meticulous records. After he knew he was dying, he organized everything: finances, correspondence, legal documents. He wanted me to understand the full picture so I could help you understand it too." "Understand what?" 3 years ago, Lauren came to Robert with a business proposal. She wanted to open her own real estate firm. High-end properties, luxury market. She asked him for $180,000 in startup capital. I stared at him. Grandpa didn't have that kind of money. He had been saving his entire life. He gave her the loan against his better judgment. They signed a formal agreement with repayment terms. Collins paused. The business collapsed within 18 months. Bad partnerships, overspending, market downturn. Lauren lost everything. She never told anyone. She hid it from most of the family. Your parents helped cover some of her debts, but the loan from Robert remained. $180,000 plus interest. She never repaid a single dollar. The pieces began falling into place. Lauren's desperation, her cruelty, the way she had signed that form without hesitation. When Robert died, Collins continued. That debt became part of his estate. Whoever inherits the estate inherits Lauren's debt. She owes me $180,000? She will. After the will reading. And she knows it. I felt sick. My sister had tried to kill me for money. Not even money she would gain, but money she wouldn't have to pay back. Collins leaned forward. Your sister isn't just selfish, Megan. She's desperate. Desperate people do desperate things. That refusal she signed wasn't just cruelty. It was financial calculation. If you died, the debt complications would go away. She tried to let me die to avoid paying a loan. I don't think she saw it as letting you die. She saw it as letting nature take its course. His voice was bitter. That's the lie people tell themselves when they do unforgivable things. Collins stood and walked to the window. When he turned back, his face was troubled. There's something else. Something Robert told me the night before he died. Tell me. Robert called me at 11:14 that night. His voice was shaking. Robert was never shaky. Collins took a breath. He said Lauren had just left with your mother. They didn't know he was awake upstairs. He heard them talking in the living room. Talking about what? About you. About your heart condition. About what might happen if you had another episode. Collins met my eyes. Lauren said that if something happened to you naturally, it would be a relief. For everyone, including you. The words hung in the air like poison. And my mother? She didn't disagree. She just said she was tired of dealing with it. Colin's voice was gentle but firm. Robert listened to that conversation and changed his entire will the next morning. I wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. Something harder had taken their place. Collins reached into his pocket and produced a small black USB drive. Robert recorded that conversation. He had a habit of keeping records from his contracting days. He left this with me, with instructions. Instructions for what? He wanted it played at the will reading, in front of everyone. Collins placed the drive on my bedside table. But that's your choice now, Megan. You can use it or you can let it go. My phone buzzed before I could respond. Unknown number. I opened the message and felt my blood run cold. The doctor can't protect you forever. Drop whatever Grandpa left you or you'll regret it. Family should stick together. I showed Collins. His jaw tightened. Lauren? Who else would call him Grandpa? I stared at the screen. She doesn't know what's on this drive. She doesn't know what he recorded. She's panicking. That makes her dangerous. After Collins left, I sat alone with my grandfather's letter. The USB drive sat beside it, small and black, and full of my family's darkest words. But the letter called to me more. I opened it carefully. 2 items inside, a photograph and folded pages. The photograph showed me at 8 years old, lying in a hospital bed after my first heart surgery. Tiny body, big eyes, wires everywhere. Grandpa Robert sat beside me, holding my hand. We were both smiling despite everything. On the back, his handwriting. The day I promised to never let anyone give up on you. I kept my word. The tears finally came. I held the photograph against my heart and let them fall. Grandpa had seen the storm coming, and he had built me a shelter I was only beginning to understand. They discharged me on Tuesday morning. Dr. Morrison signed the paperwork with strict instructions about rest, medication, and follow-up appointments. No stress, he said. I almost laughed. In 2 days, I would face the family that had tried to let me die. The logistics of recovery presented a problem. I couldn't return to my parents' house. My apartment in Philadelphia was 4 hours away. A hotel felt dangerous with Lauren circling like a shark that had tasted blood. Collins solved it before I could ask. You'll stay at my home? Guest room on the 1st floor. Quiet neighborhood. My wife Margaret is a retired cardiac nurse. I can't impose. Robert would haunt me if I let you recover in a hotel room. His tone left no room for argument. This isn't negotiable. The Collins residence was a modest colonial on a tree-lined street in suburban Pittsburgh. Nothing fancy, nothing pretentious. Exactly the kind of house Grandpa Robert would have appreciated. Margaret met us at the door with a warm smile and practical efficiency. She was in her 60s, silver-haired, with the calm competence of someone who had spent decades caring for broken hearts. Robert talked about you for years, she said, guiding me to the guest room. I feel like I already know you. The room was simple and clean. Fresh flowers on the dresser, yellow roses again. Someone had placed Grandpa's photograph on the nightstand. For the first time since arriving in Pittsburgh, I felt safe. That afternoon, I finally read the complete letter. I sat by the window with the pages in my hands, sunlight warming my shoulders, and let my grandfather's words wash over me. My dearest Megan, he wrote. If you're reading this, then the worst has happened and the best has too. You survived them, and you found me waiting. The first page was an apology. He wrote about seeing the favoritism for years, but staying silent to keep the peace. I told myself it would get better. He admitted. I was a coward. You deserved a grandfather who fought for you loudly, not one who loved you quietly. The second page broke something open inside me. He wrote about my mother, his own daughter. Helen wasn't always cold. Something changed when Lauren was born. She saw Lauren as her second chance, and you as an inherited burden. I confronted her once, years ago. She said you reminded her of everything that went wrong. Lauren was her fresh start. I had to stop reading. The words blurred through tears. My own mother had called me everything that went wrong. The third page was different, stronger. He explained everything he had put in place. The medical trust, the healthcare proxy, the will. I'm giving you weapons, Megan. Not to hurt them. To protect yourself. You don't have to use any of it. You don't have to forgive them either. Whatever you choose, know this. You were never a burden. You were the only one who made me believe this family still had a heart. The final lines I read 3 times. When you face them, and you will face them, remember who you are. Not the sick daughter, not the invisible child. You are Megan Sullivan, and you are stronger than all of them combined. I love you. I always have. I always will. Even when I'm gone, I'll be standing right beside you. That evening, Collins and I sat in his study with a laptop and speakers. The USB drive weighted like a small black bomb. Are you sure you want to hear this? He asked. I need to know exactly who they are. He pressed play. The recording was 12 minutes long. I heard Lauren's voice first, casual and calculating. Her heart has been failing for years. The doctors are surprised she's lasted this long. Do you know how much her medications cost? If something happened naturally, it would be a relief for everyone, including her. Then my mother's voice, small sounds of agreement, long silences where disagreement should have lived. One clear statement that cut deeper than anything Lauren had said. I just can't deal with it anymore. Lauren, I'm so tired. Tired of me. My mother was tired of me existing. When the recording ended, I sat in silence for a full minute. The timestamp, Collins said quietly. October 3rd. Robert changed his will on October 4th. He didn't waste a single day. I'm not going to play this at the will reading. Collins looked surprised. Are you sure? Grandpa gave me weapons, but he also taught me something else. Revenge is about making them suffer. Justice is about making things right. I looked at the USB drive in my hand. I don't need them to suffer. I just need them to face what they did. What do you want instead? The refusal form,
Robert's letter to the family. The will executed exactly as he intended.
I met Collins's eyes. And one sentence. Grandpa wrote something specific for you to say to Lauren. Collins nodded slowly. He told me. He made me memorize it. That's all I need. One sentence and his words. Let them destroy themselves. The night before the will reading, I laid out my clothes. Simple navy dress, minimal jewelry, Grandpa's photograph tucked in my purse like a talisman. My phone lit up. A text from Lauren. Can we talk before tomorrow? Just sisters? I want to apologize. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I turned the phone face down and let the darkness take the room. Tomorrow they would finally see me, and they would never be able to unsee what I showed them. The law office of Thomas Whitman occupied the 3rd floor of an old brick building in downtown Pittsburgh. Marble floors, brass plaques, heavy wooden doors, the kind of place where fortunes changed hands and families shattered. I had never been here before, but my grandfather had walked these halls for 30 years. Collins and I arrived at 9:47, 13 minutes early. My family was already waiting in the reception area, and I understood immediately that they had been strategizing. Lauren saw me first. Her face cycled through emotions like a slot machine. Surprise, anger, then a forced smile as she stood and moved toward me with arms outstretched. Megan, I'm so glad you're okay. I was so worried. I raised one hand, said nothing, walked past her like she was furniture. The look on her face told me she finally understood. The rules had changed. The conference room was elegant and somber. A long mahogany table, 8 leather chairs, windows overlooking the Pittsburgh skyline. A portrait of Grandpa Robert sat on a side table near the door. Whitman's touch, honoring an old friend. We took our seats like opposing armies. Lauren, my mother, and my father on one side. Collins and me on the other. Thomas Whitman sat at the head of the table, silver-haired and grave, holding a folder that contained my grandfather's final words. Thank you all for coming,
Whitman began. This is the reading of the last will and testament of Robert James Sullivan. Before we begin, I must note that Robert left specific instructions for how this reading should proceed. He asked that all parties remain seated until the reading is complete. Lauren shifted impatiently. Can we just get to the distribution? Some of us have busy schedules. Whitman looked at her over his glasses. Ms. Sullivan, your grandfather anticipated that response. He asked me to remind you that patience was never your strength. Perhaps today you'll learn. Lauren's face reddened. My mother put a hand on her arm. Even now, soothing Lauren. Protecting Lauren. Whitman opened the folder and began reading. The legal language was standard at first, but then came something different. A personal statement Robert had insisted on including. I have spent my life building things. Whitman read aloud. Houses, relationships, a family. Some of those structures were strong. Others, I now realize, were built on foundations of sand. This will represent my final attempt to correct mistakes I should have addressed years ago. To those who showed loyalty and love, you will be rewarded. To those who showed cruelty disguised as practicality, you will receive what you deserve. Lauren's confident expression flickered. The primary residence at 847 Oakwood Drive, Pittsburgh, valued at approximately $650,000. Whitman paused. I leave entirely to my granddaughter, Megan Elizabeth Sullivan. Lauren stood so fast her chair scraped against the floor. That's impossible. That house was supposed to... Please sit down, Miss Sullivan. There must be a mistake. An older version. Collins spoke for the first time. Sit down, Lauren. Now. Something in his voice made her comply. Whitman turned to Collins. Robert's will contains unusual provisions. He asked that certain evidence be presented before the remaining bequests are read. Collins stood and opened his briefcase.
He removed a single document and placed it on the table where everyone could see. A medical form, a signature line, handwriting I recognized as my sister's. 5 days ago, Collins said, Megan Sullivan was admitted to Pittsburgh General with acute cardiac arrhythmia. She required emergency surgery. Without intervention, she would have died within hours. This document is a refusal of treatment form, signed by Lauren Sullivan as healthcare proxy. He pointed to the signature. I was present when it was signed. I witnessed Lauren Sullivan say these exact words. Don't waste money on her. She's been a burden her whole life. I was thinking of the family's finances, Lauren protested. The surgery was risky. The surgery had a 97% success rate. You weren't managing risk. You were making a calculation. You calculated that your sister's death was worth more than her life. My mother tried to intervene. Lauren was under stress. She didn't mean... Collins turned to her. Mrs. Sullivan, you were present. You said nothing. You did nothing. Your silence was its own signature. Whitman cleared his throat. Robert left one additional instruction. He asked that Dr. Collins deliver a specific message at this point. Collins walked slowly around the table until he stood directly behind Lauren's chair. She tried to turn, but he placed one hand on her shoulder, anchoring her in place. Robert composed this message 8 months ago, Collins said. He made me memorize it. These are his words, not mine. The room went silent.
Lauren, you signed a paper to let your sister die, but you forgot that the hand which signed your inheritance was mine.
And I unsigned you the moment I learned who you really are. Lauren's face drained of color. Her mouth opened and closed without sound. Whitman continued reading. The medical trust of $200,000 went to me. The book collection, the personal journals, the woodworking tools. All to me. The remaining assets, approximately $300,000. All to me. To my granddaughter Lauren Marie Sullivan, Whitman read, I leave the outstanding balance of the loan she owes my estate, $180,000. This debt is to be collected in full. Lauren owed the estate. I inherited the estate. Lauren owed me $180,000. To my daughter Helen and son-in-law David, I leave $5,000 each. Whitman paused. Robert included a note. Enough to remember I was your father, not enough to forget how you failed your daughter. My mother broke into sobs. My father stared at the table, silent as always. Lauren stood, facing me with wild eyes. You did this. You turned him against me. I met her gaze without flinching. I didn't do anything, Lauren. You did. You signed that form. You said those words. Grandpa just made his choice. I'm your sister. Family forgives. No, you were my sister. Past tense. Family doesn't sign death warrants. At the door, Lauren turned back one final time. Her mascara was running. Her voice cracked. What are you going to do? Sue me? Press charges? I looked at the woman who had signed a paper to let me die. I'm going to live, Lauren. That's it. I'm going to live a full, beautiful life that you tried to take from me. And you're going to spend the rest of yours knowing what you did. Knowing everyone in this room heard it. Knowing Grandpa knew. I turned back to Whitman's desk. Behind me, I heard the door close. I heard my sister crying. And I felt nothing at all. The parking garage was cold and gray. Our footsteps echoed against concrete as Collins walked me to his car. The weight of what had just happened was still settling into my bones. I leaned against the passenger door and took a deep breath. How are you feeling? Collins asked. I considered the question seriously. Like I just set down a suitcase I've been carrying for 33 years. I didn't realize how heavy it was until it was gone. Through the garage exit, I watched Lauren's Mercedes peel out onto the street, tires squealing. My parents' car was still parked in the corner. They hadn't emerged yet. probably sitting inside, processing, blaming each other, or me. I realized I didn't care anymore. 2 weeks later, I was back in my Philadelphia apartment when my mother called. I almost didn't answer, but I decided I owed myself the closure, not her. "Megan, we need to talk." Her voice sounded older, shakier. "Your father and I made mistakes. We know that now. We want to make things right. Can you come home for Thanksgiving?" "Home?" I let the word hang in the air. "That house belongs to me now, Mom. And no, I won't be coming." "Please, Megan, we're family. I'm not cutting you off completely, not like Lauren. But I need time, maybe years, maybe forever." I paused, choosing my next words carefully. "If you want me in your life, you need to understand something. I'm not the burden anymore. I'm not the problem to manage. If we rebuild anything, it starts with you acknowledging what you did, what you allowed." "We never meant to." "I know you never meant to, but you did, and not meaning to doesn't undo 33 years. I hung up without saying goodbye. It didn't feel cruel, it felt necessary. Lauren's life unraveled quickly after that. Whitman's office sent the formal collection notice, $180,000 plus interest. She couldn't pay. She sold the Mercedes, downsized her apartment, watched her real estate career collapse as word spread through the small industry. Old cousin Margaret made sure the extended family knew exactly what had happened at that will reading. Lauren became a ghost at family gatherings. No one explicitly banned her. They just stopped inviting. She tried to reach me. Texts went unanswered. Emails returned to sender. One letter arrived at my apartment with her handwriting on the envelope. I threw it away without opening it. 6 months later, I moved into Grandpa Robert's house. 847 Oakwood Drive, the home he had built with his own hands 45 years ago. I kept his study exactly as he left it. The books arranged by author, his reading chair by the window, his woodworking tools hanging on the garage wall. The rest of the house I made my own. New paint, new furniture, my own touches on the life he had given me. Spring arrived slowly that year. I learned to tend his garden, coaxing flowers back to life after a winter of neglect. I transferred to my firm's Pittsburgh office. Shorter commute, less stress, a life that finally felt like mine. Collins checked my heart every 3 months. The rhythm held steady. The medical trust covered everything. For the first time, healthcare wasn't a constant worry. Every Sunday, I visited Grandpa's grave with yellow roses. I talked to him like he was still there, told him about my week, my progress, the small victories and quiet joys. One April evening, I was organizing his desk when I found a drawer I hadn't opened. Inside was a folder labeled Megan, from birth. Every card I had ever sent him, every photograph from every visit, crayon drawings from childhood, report cards, graduation announcements. At the bottom, a letter he had never sent, dated 1 week before he died. "My dearest Megan, I don't have much time left. The doctors think I don't know, but I do. I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of leaving you alone with them. But I've done everything I can. All that's left is this. You were the best part of my life, not the house, not the money. You. Every Sunday phone call, every visit, every card. You made an old man feel loved, and I hope someday you'll feel as loved as you made me feel. Live, Megan. Really live. Not just survive. That's my final wish. Not for me. For you." I held the letter against my heart and whispered to the empty room. "I'm trying, Grandpa. I'm really trying." And I finally understood. Family isn't blood. It's choice. Strength isn't silence. It's speaking. Forgiveness isn't required. Healing is. Living well isn't revenge. It's the whole point. Grandpa said I was the heart of the family. He was only partly right. I wasn't the heart of their family. I was the heart of mine. the family I would build, the life I would choose, the love I would give to people who actually wanted it. If you're listening to this, maybe you know what it feels like to be the invisible one, the burden, the daughter they forgot or the sister they dismissed. Maybe you're still carrying that suitcase filled with decades of not being enough. I want you to know something. You can set it down. Not for them. For you. You don't have to forgive people who hurt you. You don't have to stay connected to people who tried to destroy you. You just have to choose yourself. Maybe for the first time ever. Have you ever been the invisible one in your family? Have you ever walked away from people who should have loved you? Tell me your story in the comments. Not for me. For the thousands of other women watching who need to know they're not alone. If this story touched something in you, I hope you'll subscribe to this channel. Every week we share stories about women who were underestimated and dismissed until they found their voice. When you subscribe, you become part of a community. Not just viewers, family, the kind that actually shows up. Grandpa Robert told me I was a heart buried in a family that forgot how to feel. But hearts don't stay buried forever. They beat, they heal, they find their way back to the light. And so will you, I promise.